Hello from RUSI in London. I'm Neil Melvin, the Director of International Security, and welcome to this webinar, which we're convening to mark the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and is devoted to thinking globally about Russia and what will it do next in terms of its international affairs. Russia's war against Ukraine has really transformed international security, and the shockwaves of the war continue to reverberate around the world. At the center of these shockwaves is Russia and its new foreign and security policy that have really stemmed from the invasion of Ukraine. We've seen Russia developing new ties with China, North Korea, Iran, and other allies, but also engaging in increasing competition with the Euro-Atlantic community in the global south, particularly focused on the United Nations. And the Euro-Atlantic community itself has started to restructure its defense and security policies in response to Russia, as we saw just yesterday with the UK government's announcement of an increase in its defense expenditure. In today's discussion, the focus will be clearly on Russia and how its war in Ukraine has affected its international position. In this discussion, we'd like to take stock of how the past 3 years has really reshaped Russia's role as an international actor and how it continues to change, but also to look ahead, notably in the context of a possible Ukraine settlement, to see how Russia will seek to build its international engagement and how countries around the world will respond to that, focusing in particular on the Middle East, Latin America, Asia, but also looking at the European continent. To do this, we're drawing on RUSI's regional expertise and the team in international security. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. They are Emily Ferris, who's the Russia and Eurasia Senior Fellow, Burcu Ozcelik, who covers the Middle East, Ed Arnold, the Senior Fellow covering European security, and Carlos Solar, the Senior Fellow on Latin America. The structure of today's discussion will involve presentations by each of our speakers, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from our audience. So please do post your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom, which you'll see on the bottom of the screen. So now I'd like to turn to our first speaker, Emily Ferris, who'll be looking at Russia's own approach to its international position.
Thanks very much, Neil, and good morning, everybody. I think, especially at this time of really quite considerable political flux around the Ukraine war and Trump and the negotiations, I think we can sometimes get a little bit lost in the rhetoric, and there isn't a lot of clarity about really the core of what matters to these countries, especially Russia. So what Trump has done is actually kind of return to the fore a bit of an idea of about some kind of engagement with Russia, whatever that looks like. And I think when Russia invaded Ukraine, it was largely agreed, at least in most European countries, that diplomacy with Russia was dead, and that engagement amounted to capitulation, or worse, kind of endorsement of Russia's way of looking at the world. But this might be about to shift slightly. And now the discussion is moving towards what a future engagement with Russia might look like, and why having a Russia strategy is important, and why it might be in our own security interest to try to manage this relationship on our own terms. So I think today I'm going to reflect a bit on how Russian foreign policy making actually works, and what kind of narratives feed into the discussion of policy making, and what seems to be a bit of a priority for Russia in terms of its international relationships. So first, I think we can understand quite a lot of how Russia sees itself through its foreign policy concept of 2023. And now it sounds quite boring, but actually this was a really important strategic document that was published in the middle of the war. And it showed not just Russia's intentions towards its international partners, but also how it sees its place in the world and what we can kind of consider to be Russia's national interests. And I think the first thing it really showed was that where Russia sees itself in the global order. It showed Russia kind of drawing this link between Europe and India and China and parts of the Asia-Pacific region, which it calls a Greater Eurasia. So Russia's really calling itself a Eurasian and Euro-Pacific power at the center of this kind of territory. And it considers itself to be a power that is able to actually just move seamlessly between all three of those concepts. And the second thing that I thought was quite interesting was you can really see how geography and history and their links to security all really play into the way that Russia sees itself as this pan-Eurasian power. So Russia thinks that because of its size and where it is geographically, it's got a really important stake in international affairs. And so it should have equal consideration and respect from other powers, especially the US. But the problem is physical geography is also a weakness for Russia because of its history of invasion during the Second World War, the moving borders between Russia and China, and Russia doesn't have any natural boundaries that act like a buffer. So there is a bit of a collective trauma in Russia historically about the potential dissolution of society. And of course, the Kremlin can kind of harness that and weaponize that in service of a narrative that creates a bit of an existential fear of attack. And then the last point, the third one, is Russia's exceptionalism. There's a role for things like the Russian Orthodox Church in that too, where Russia characterizes itself as really the only true Orthodox Christian kingdom. It's based on these kind of slightly nebulous ideas of Russian traditional values, and that there's something unique about Russia, basically. But then the way that this is used practically is that there's an idea that Russia isn't like a civilization. That Russia is a civilization, and it's got most of the world's major religions, nationalities, languages. It's not European, it's not Asian, it's kind of in between. And this kind of ability to be a bit of a chameleon means that Russia can be quite flexible in its foreign policy. It can apply it when it's convenient. So, for example, when Russia tries to engage with the Middle East, they use their Muslim identity. So that's why you've got places like Chechnya playing a really outsized role in foreign policy in comparison to how big the territory is. When Russia engages with China, it uses that foundation of a greater Eurasian partnership as that core of that integration. And so that exceptionalism and that chameleonic identity kind of drives a lot of the way that Russia is involved in regional and global affairs. So all of this obviously makes it quite difficult to deal with Russia that thinks like this. But even if Russians' foreign policy strategies don't always have things like clear financial resources to implement them, what they do show is Russia is planning for the long term. And there is a need for Russia to pull other countries along with its way of looking at the world against the West. So what I thought was quite revealing was that after Trump's inauguration, it showed quite clearly what Putin's priorities are. So if you look beyond the sort of semi-gleeful headlines about Russia being grateful for a Trump presidency, actually the first thing Putin did after Trump was sworn in was to call President Xi. And they had a meeting with his own Security Council. And the call with Xi was quite a serious one about some logistical issues they're having, and also how Russia and China engage with Trump. And when he had the meeting with the Security Council, they were talking about what the impact of Trump could be on Middle Eastern stability. Of course, Russia has a really important stake in that. Then around this, you've got presidential elections in Belarus, which is obviously Russia's closest political ally. So even though a lot of the focus has been on this Putin-Trump dynamic, what all of this showed was that actually the three major foreign policy concerns for Russia at the moment are its ability to kind of project power and military might in the Middle Eastern region, given Assad's removal, the importance of its trade relationship with China, upon which its economy really depends at the moment, and its relationship with Belarus, which is a really important player in European regional security. So I think what the war did do was it really accelerated Russia's need to find countries that were prepared to kind of put aside some of their moral qualms and either kind of buy into or at least not object to Russia's way of looking at the world. And I think the big question is, which I think we're all very happy to talk about, is how do you then engage with a country that says and it thinks like this? So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emily. On that last point that you just made about engagement, I think there's quite a strong interpretation of Russia, and particularly of the Putin regime, that it's actually driven by confrontation and war and conflict, and that Putin has used those tools actually as part of the Russian state building project, his ability to consolidate political power. We've seen that from the Second Chechen War, the engagements in the South Caucasus, the Middle East. So the Ukraine war is part of a long arc in which Putin has used coercion and building a security state as a political tool. Given that, and sort of looking ahead, if the Ukraine war does come to a conclusion, do you think that the likely risk is that Russia will continue to approach the world in a confrontational way, that Putin will need, in fact, confrontation in order to maintain his power base?
Well, first of all, I wonder if I would say that Putin is always sort of conflict driven. It really depends. And actually, there are examples of where Russia has shown, I guess, restraint or caution, and especially around places like Syria, especially around its relationship with Israel. And I think there are some sort of political and pragmatic concerns that stop Russia from, I guess, this kind of a blind sort of war-driven agenda. I don't really think that actually they are sort of always driven by war. But then when it comes to Ukraine, it's a completely different story, because Russia has always been very clear that Ukraine and Belarus are this air of Russian religious, political, historical, all of these things, tradition that unites them. And of course, we don't have to buy into that. We don't have to agree with it. It doesn't legitimize it whatsoever. But it does mean that it goes beyond this kind of traditional idea of Soviet spheres of influence. Russia believes that it has the right to absorb and dictate the political direction of those countries, which is why anything like NATO membership, anything like closeness with the European Union is complete anathema to Russia. So in terms of engaging with it in the longer term, I guess the problem is that you can never really remove that way of thinking from places like Ukraine. And I think Zelensky is all too aware of that, which is why he's pushing for these security guarantees for Ukraine, because a frozen conflict in the East does not mean that Russia will leave it alone. It's always going to be looming very large for Russia, I think, in terms of its foreign policy priorities.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to move to the European theatre. I mean, the European continent has perhaps been most drastically affected by the Ukraine war, and this continues to evolve. But before Ed Arnold makes his comments, could I just remind everyone, please do post your questions in the Q&A part of Zoom. We're already getting some questions coming in, but please start to send them now so we can build up some questions to go back to the panel once we've completed the first round of presentations. Over to you, Ed.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Emily, for providing a lot of context of what I'll speak about in terms of Europe. And I think I'll start by a caveat, which is by the time that RUSI uploads this video to the website and YouTube, my comments on Europe might already be out of date, such as the sort of fast changing nature of the scenario that we're currently now in, and you know, making that partly as a joke, but also as a serious sort of policy challenge for Europe. That actually the speed at which the US wants to go in terms of the bilateral relationship with Russia, Europeans just can't cope. I mean, partly structurally, getting all 27 foreign ministers from the EU or 32 defense or foreign ministers from NATO or leaders, I mean, very, very difficult to cohere that really, you know, strong policy on Russia, and also it's, you know, quite delayed. We're still waiting for a Russia strategy from NATO that NATO was unable to deal with when we had a Biden administration, when we had all of that unity, when we had 2 new members within NATO. And now I think really that opportunity has gone. And I think the points that Emily made in terms of the long-term plan, you know, the being a bit of a chameleon. I mean, Europe, be it at an organizational level or collectively as nations, even coalition of nations, just not dynamic enough in terms of this issue. And I think, you know, weekly Elysee therapy sessions are not really helping anyone, and it's too insular from the European viewpoint. And it's quite stark that, yes, President Macron and Prime Minister Starmer have gone to Washington, but it's taken 5 weeks. You know, this needs to, Europeans need to start engaging, particularly with the US, because again, within that bilateral, it's quite easy for the Europeans not to have a voice. And I don't think they're actually also giving themselves that voice. And then in terms of the political changes that we've seen from the war, I mean, as Neil said, dramatic changes within Europe. That, you know, the high point of unity probably at the end of 2022, 2 new allies that I've already spoken about, which really changes Sakhar's area of operations in Europe for the better, and a significantly hardening defense posture. But actually, in terms of where we are now in really the last couple of weeks, I would distinctly say that we're in a renewed crisis. This isn't just a follow-on from 2022, and it's actually worse for Europe, because back in 2022, it was very clear that Putin and Russia were the aggressor, and that gave that sort of cohesive unity to the Europeans to press ahead in many regards. both not just within NATO, but in terms of the EU. But the principal source of instability now is coming directly from the commander-in-chief of the preeminent ally of NATO. And that is very, very difficult for the Europeans to deal with that, for all of the reasons that we know in terms of Europeans deprioritizing defense and security and allowing the US to take the lead on that. And then also, I think the main change from 2022, which is an evolution, it's not an immediate change, but we're seeing it now, is domestic political pressures, particularly from parties on far right and far left, that almost all countries are experiencing. So again, causing them to look internally rather than externally. And then, the traditional sort of what we call in terms of alliance politics, the spoilers. We always used to get questions on Turkey and Hungary and then stalling Finland and Sweden's membership of NATO. But my point to that was always, well, it's Hungary and Turkey today. It could be others soon. So Slovakia, prime example. We've just seen the elections within Germany recently, and the AfD coming second. And there's a French presidential election in 2027. So those issues and those pressures are also going to play a big part. And I think talking about some of the economic factors, I think this is one of the biggest changes of the war, which Russia has really lost Europe as a sort of large-scale energy customer. We saw that the Baltic states switched off from the Russian electricity grid this week. It's not all a rosy picture within Europe, but I think that is a strategic change in terms of the continent and also Russia. And that's really where the concern, I think, at the moment over US-Russia rapprochement, in terms of sanctions, potential sanctions relief, potentially Russia being readmitted to the G8. When they're spending so much money on defense, then any increases in their GDP is just going to allow NATO to be on Russia to be on quicker and pose more of a threat to NATO. And I think I'll use the example of the EU at the moment. I think Kaja Kallas, the new high rep, she talks tough. She's a very, very good communicator. They've just agreed their 16th sanctions package. But actually, when you look at it from an economic perspective, both in terms of trading in oil with Russia, also providing oil tankers to the shadow fleet, recent investigation by a Dutch investigative outlet was that 21 of 35 countries that have bypassed the oil trade with Russia was from Europe. Greece supplying 37% of the shadow fleet for Russia. That's a backdoor that needs to be closed. And also in terms of exports, when you look at direction of trade statistics between Europe and Russia, although it's dropped in terms of trade from Russia, and that's certainly the case in terms of the Nordics. In other countries such as Germany and Poland, yes, they cut with Russia, but then they went significantly increased in Central Asia. So Germany's monthly exports to Kyrgyzstan went from around 6 million euros in 2022 to around 80 in early 2024. All of the leaders within Europe, they have access to this data. They know what's going on. But in terms of talking about that maximum pressure, I think the question is, are Europeans prepared to pay for it? And it needs to be across the board. There's no point in putting maximum pressure in terms of sanctions when there's all of these other areas which is increasing or allowing that sort of trade and that engagement with Russia to continue. And then finally, just on security, I think the threat to Europe in terms of conventional forces, that's down because of the issue that the Russians have had in Ukraine, and this turning into a attritional conflict. But in terms of hybrid escalation, some estimates the rise of 700% increase in hybrid incidents across foreign malign influence, provocation, sabotage since the war had started. And they're also becoming more overt and impactful. And this is intrinsically linked to the Ukraine-Russia-US deal, and in terms of what the future is on the ground in Ukraine, which we're sort of going through at the moment, where the Europeans are struggling to be heard and are trying to get a seat at that table. And it's also very much linked into the future of NATO, and it's no real change from pre-war. It's about the strength, unity of NATO and the strength of Article 5 in terms of how we believe it to be actioned, but also in terms of how Putin believes that the alliance treats Article 5. And I think really when we're talking about this, although the focus is on Ukraine at the moment, in terms of all of our nations, in terms of alliance members, their priority needs to be in terms of keeping NATO together in as close to its current form as possible, noting that it will go through change as well, because ultimately Ukraine and NATO, people are saying, well, that's how you get security. But if NATO is not functioning well, especially potentially Article 5, then it doesn't actually provide any security guarantee to Ukraine. So the priority has to be NATO, which again is that's really no change in terms of European security since the Cold War and over. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. The unity that you highlighted in Europe on Ukraine was in many ways forged by the Biden administration going into the war, that there were quite substantial different interpretations of Russia's intentions towards Ukraine and whether they would indeed invade. And there were also quite different economic and diplomatic relations across Europe with Russia. If the Ukraine war ends, do you think that the European unity will hold? I mean, already we see quite differentiated subgroupings. If you look at defense spending, then clearly some parts of Europe feel a Russian threat much more than others. So can this unity that's been forged during the war sort of remain in place, do you think?
Well, I think the unity really was at a high point, probably end of 22, beginning of 23, and it's been gradually eroding since then. And obviously it's eroding a little bit more. And I think in terms of Europe, as part of the wider Euro-Atlantic alliance, that you might be able to get a considerable amount of unity there. The issue is, what does that mean where the actual the principal policy change is actually coming from the US. And I think the biggest risk for Europeans is actually deploying military forces to Ukraine to secure that peace in terms of whatever agreement, because NATO can't do it because Putin would never agree to it. The EU can't do it. So you're left with a coalition of the willing. And while coalitions of the willing in the short term are quite powerful because they can go, they can act, they can do things, they can agree amongst themselves, it's far too easy for coalitions of the willing to be picked off, and effectively you take off the weakest link, that starts to fray. And I think putting European forces within Ukraine, especially without Article 5 explicitly covering them, that gives Putin a potential target to use all of the variety of means that we know he uses to pick that away. You know, it happened in Afghanistan, it happened in Iraq. Those were the discretionary operations. This is far more serious, obviously, because it's really existential for Europeans.
Thanks very much. And perhaps now we could move to the Middle East, which has been identified by Russia as a key theater. Historically, the Soviet Union played a leading role in the Middle East, and President Putin's deployment of Russian forces to Syria was seen as a return to Russia's great power status. It was designed to be used as a springboard for wider engagements in North Africa, Red Sea, Indian Ocean. But in recent times, of course, we've seen this apparent collapse of Russia's position, at least in Syria. So I'd now like to turn to our Middle East specialist, Burcu, who's perhaps going to address the question of where does Russia now go in the Middle East, but how do Middle East countries look at Russia as an actor in the region? Burcu.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you to everyone for joining us. So I think I'm going to try to address those questions, Neil, that you rightfully raised. Before I do so, I wanted to focus some remarks on the sets of relations and the accompanying interests and constraints in the current security landscape impacting Russia, Turkey, and Iran, mainly in the context of ongoing and fast evolving dynamics in Syria. You know, as we've mentioned, Russia has historically had a long-standing interest in the Middle East as a strategic sphere of influence. It's also been seen as strategically adjacent to the Black Sea, with important interconnections, especially via Russia's relationship with Turkey. The key driver of Russia's post-Cold War engagement with Middle East policy has been the desire for predictability rather than the spread of an ideological grand narrative. And again, this is within the context of Russia's enduring rivalry with the West. So important to note, and I think this crosses over all of our thematic areas and jurisdictions, I think it's important to note that at the outset that just as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the ensuing war sparked new sets of alliances, new economic trade routes, alternatives for energy supply and the transfer of weapons, as well as sanctions busting mechanisms between Russia and Iran, and Ed mentioned the Shadow Fleet, of course. Now, the prospect of some sort of peace deal over Ukraine and the possible normalization of US-Russia ties, I think, will challenge in important ways the de facto arrangements that have been made in the Middle East as well since the invasion of Ukraine. And this has implications for Turkey and Iran most directly, I would argue. I think the first point is that over the course of the past few months, I think the Middle East, and particularly the Arab Gulf states, as well as Turkey, has gained some recognition as sites of diplomatic engagement and diplomacy. Riyadh, of course, hosted the U.S.-Russia talks last week and was previously engaged in prisoner swap negotiations. And Saudi has been championing its role and profile as a diplomatic powerhouse in its own right as a mediator. I don't think this is necessarily an indication of a desire for a warmer or strategic relationship at an escalated level between Saudi Arabia and Russia. It's rather an instrument used by Riyadh to improve its standing with the United States and facilitate a dynamic containment approach towards Iran's military and nuclear program. And the same can be said for Qatar, which is engaged in, there's been an uptick in trade and investment with Russia. But again, Russia does not necessarily top Doha's strategic agenda. If we turn to Syria, the fall of Assad's regime in December of 24 has significantly altered the balance of power there and redefined regional roles, both for Syrian actors and also external actors that have had a stake in the multi-sided and protracted civil war there. So we've seen, of course, a pronounced decline in Russian influence. Turkey has capitalized on the opportunity to assert itself as a key regional power. And of course, Assad's collapse can at least partially, but in important ways, be attributed to Russia's shifting focus to the war in Ukraine, and which diverted resources away from Syria. So Russia saw its status decline swiftly in Syria, but the early assessments that the fall of Putin's long-term ally would spell the irreversible end of Russia's strategic interests in Syria, I think, appear to be short-sighted. Of course, we have the case of the Hmeimim Air Base and the Tartus Naval Base, and these have provided a strategic foothold for Russia in the Eastern Mediterranean, a logistical hub for operations beyond its natural borders, beyond its periphery, particularly in Africa and Libya. And Tartus has been a key base for Russia in recent years, allowing it to refuel, resupply, and repair vessels in the Mediterranean. So these are not assets that Russia is prepared to lose very quickly. And although we saw movement in the early days and weeks following the fall of Assad, there is now a growing sense that based on dialogue and engagement with the current caretaker government in Damascus, there is an effort to that Russia is trying to mitigate its losses and negotiate the new terms of its ongoing presence in Syria, and that will be different, of course, from those that were established during the Assad regime. But it's again too soon to discount Russia from the new emerging security and political landscape in Syria. There's also the important dynamic around the Russia-Israel relationship. Russia's military deployment to Syria made it Israel's de facto neighbor and was an important factor in Israel's calculations about Iran's military and nuclear ambitions. We're seeing now more concern emerging from Israel's political and security establishment as to the new caretaker government in Damascus and what this could mean for Israeli security. We have seen announcements over the past few days with Prime Minister Netanyahu stating that Israel would not tolerate a military presence south of Damascus. And there, of course, the connections to Israel providing security guarantees to the Druze community or elements within the Druze community in the south and the southwest of Syria as well. So a changing dynamic on the Israel-Russia front. Of course, the downfall of the Assad regime also and the termination of the gas transit through Ukraine have increased Turkey's leverage over Russia. The new reality in Syria, which is itself shifting, continues to be fluid, is one where Turkey and Russia may face more tensions in the months and years ahead. This dynamic may be impacted severely with the looming Trump deal. A related component of this, and I suspect that we might address this in the Q&A, is of course the Iran-Russia link-up. Iran is a strategic ally of Russia, having recently signed a 20-year strategic agreement. Iran, of course, has been reported widely to have provided Russia with armed drones in its war against Ukraine. And this emerging axis across Russia and Iran, which is not new, but has been accelerated and deepened, is seen as an affront against the US-led rules-based order. So through its ties with Russia, Iran was also able to assert greater superiority or leverage over Turkey in the competition to expand their respective national sort of spheres of influence over Syria. And we're seeing this dynamic alter now as well. Yesterday, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said that Iran and Russia would continue to work together to mitigate the negative impacts of Western sanctions on their economies. And there appears to be, however, growing debate and apprehension among some circles in Tehran about the US-Russia relationship and the emerging terms of what a Trump agreement might look like, amidst fears that Russia might turn against Tehran, or at least not be as committed as it was just a few weeks ago. And the Trump administration now may see Russia as part of a grand bargain that has implications for Iran. So if part of the agreement to end the war in Ukraine opens the path for Trump-Putin discussions, where Moscow is seen as an instrument to exert pressure on Iran, this would undercut Iran's ability to regain influence in Syria. But at a more strategic level, it may further isolate Iran and squeeze its revenue sources at a time when it's already sort of crippled by sanctions. For its part, Turkey plays a balancing act, traditionally has done, vis-a-vis Russia, given competition in the Black Sea and Turkey's US relationship and membership in NATO. Turkey recently is repositioning itself and reasserting itself as a potential guarantor of European security. Ankara hosted President Zelensky recently, of course. So Turkey is concerned that it has, like the EU, been shut out of US-Russian conversations on Ukraine, and President Erdogan seeks to change this. The Russia threat, of course, led to increased interest in cooperation with Turkey among some European allies, and now Ankara wants to capitalize on this and turn this into more sort of tangible results. If Russia retains the territories conquered in Ukraine following any peace talks, I think the importance of the Black Sea region will take on a new dimension. And in this case, Ankara has made it clear that the safety of shipping in the Black Sea would have to be re-examined. As a result, it may become inevitable that Turkey is among the countries providing such security guarantees. So still a fluid situation. The Middle East, of course, has historically been, following Europe, one of the key areas of strategic importance for Russia. And whilst that's changing, the parameters of it, are changing, I think it's too soon to discount Russia's enduring interest in the Middle East going forward as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Burcu. On the enduring interest in the region, Russia's intervention in Syria was initially framed very much in terms of protecting the Assad regime, which had been the pillar of Soviet engagement. So it was a long-term interest in the region, pivoting around Syria, and particularly the Assad regime itself. I mean, that's now gone. And at the same time now, as you highlighted, we have the Iran-Russia axis opening up. Do you think that means that Russia's interests may be shifting in the region, that actually being linked to Iran means that Russia has an emerging different set of interests across the region from what it was a few years ago when Syria was very much the focus of its regional approach?
Yes, certainly. Well, yes and no. I think that the closer relationship between Moscow and Tehran now gives Putin greater leverage potentially in being seen as an actor that has some influence to be able to pressure and influence Iranian behavior as it enters this new phase of potential deal or no deal engagement on the nuclear program between the US and Iran. So Russia has positioned itself, and in many ways, this mimics what Turkey had been doing as an actor that could talk to both the US and Iran. And I think this might come in handy for Putin as he engages with the Trump administration, not only on Ukraine, clearly that is a priority, but on the Iran file as well. And Tehran is closely monitoring this and is acutely aware of the possibility that Russia might downgrade the level of Iran's strategic importance to Russia. Russia, of course, is also likely to continue to want to be seen as a major actor in Syria. I think the very recent memory of Russia's violent, brutal aerial bombardment against civilians in northwestern Syria and in the governorate of Idlib, it's not forgotten. It's not lost upon the HTS, and certainly not lost upon the Syrians. At the same time, however, because the situation in Syria is so fluid and still very fragile, HTS, the government in Damascus, is also trying to hedge its bets. It's trying a multidimensional approach, engagement with the West on one hand, but is cautious about alienating Russia on the other. And so we're seeing this very delicate balancing act, which will likely continue as long as the U.S. maintains its sanctions regime against Syria.
Thanks very much. And then to complete the presentations from our panel, I'd like to move to Carlos Solar. Carlos covers Latin America, and of course, Latin America, I think, initially saw itself as rather far away from the war in Europe and the war in Ukraine, but then very quickly became the focus for competitive diplomacy between Russia and the Euro-Atlantic community, particularly focused on the UN, and the countries in the region were being asked to take sides and form a position. Carlos, how now are the countries in Latin America looking at the evolving sort of discussion around ending the Ukraine war and where their relations with Russia may then go?
Thank you, Neil. I think the privilege of coming last is that I've had a peek at the Q&A section. So I think I'm going to try to answer to your questions, to Emily's initial question on whether Russian diplomacy is dead in the region or not. And then I'll try to address one of the questions that caught my eye, which was how is Russia staying afloat with new economic ties to regions as far away as Latin America, which I think all my previous colleagues have mentioned. Initially, relations between Latin America and Russia differ, of course. There are a set of countries which have stood by Russia since day one of the war, namely Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, and Bolivia, that despite them not being a contributor to Russia's economy largely, mostly Venezuela maybe, but given the current situation economically there, it's not much that they can support Russia economically. I think this set of countries really represents the international message behind the war, which is Russia sending there is an alternative to the West. So these countries have a long-standing relationship with Moscow since the end of the Cold War. Countries that have exchanged military technologies, the economy, certain key sectors of their industry are there thanks to engineers coming from Moscow and so on. So I also think that that Russia shouldn't be seen alone in the region. It should be seen in conjunction with China and with Iran and with other countries that have presented an alternative, especially in these countries that have absolutely sided with Russia since the start of the war. So I think, is diplomacy dead? Well, for some countries, it's really put in the refrigerator, in the congelador, mostly because countries like Argentina, Chile, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, they've had good relationships with Russia since the 2000s. You must think about Brazil, for instance, being a member of the BRICS, and what that forum represents. It represents a new brotherhood of countries that are aspiring to something different. And Brazil has always been a key generator of that idea, not just within the Western Hemisphere, but in connection to the rest of the world, in connection to China, to South Africa, to the Middle East, and to some countries elsewhere in Asia. So I think that countries will be pragmatic in terms of having frozen relations, but they're pretty much waiting to what's going to happen in the long term. And I think that exemplifies what's common within diplomacy in Latin America, which is small countries looking pretty much at the international law and how they benefit from international law. Now, obviously that the Russian war has created a new puzzle when it comes to respecting international law, which is why a larger country is invading a smaller country and basically not respecting global governance. I think this sends strong signals to countries in Latin America, which had bilateral rivalries in certain hotspots, and which we've seen recently with Venezuela having an iron fist policy towards neighbor Guyana. If we switch the script and we stop talking about Russia for a moment, let's talk about Ukraine diplomacy, because I think it's part of the equation as well, especially in Latin America. So Ukraine diplomacy before the war was in a low level. They only had a particular diplomatic relationships with certain countries. And as a trigger from the war, we've seen a new diplomacy strategy, which is called the communications strategy with Latin America, which has not only revamped relationships with the region, but it has also grown quite strong with the European Union and with other members of the Euro-Atlantic relationship. So you don't just see the Ukrainian ambassadors in Chile, Mexico, and Argentina addressing the audience in those countries, but pretty much going to events which are supported by the rest of Europe. So I don't think that Ukraine is playing along in Latin America, but it's actually created an alliance with the rest of these countries, which have given them momentum and more energy towards sending a signal that it is against those adversaries of democracy, of the international order, and the rule of law, which is all about what this war is about. So how could an end to the war revamp Russia's relationships? I think countries in Latin America are, besides Mexico and Brazil, top middle powers and then secondary powers, and pretty much middle powers in a regional understanding of the concept. So they need to be quite pragmatic in terms of which opportunities will reopen if Russia is allowed to open up its trade and commerce with the rest of the region. That doesn't mean that certain countries have stood by Russia. For instance, Brazil. I think Brazil with Lula da Silva, a president that shared a lot with Vladimir Putin during his first two presidencies back in the mid-2000s. They grew to know each other. They became good friends. They empowered the BRICS. So Lula da Silva knows pretty well Vladimir Putin, and he knows that Vladimir Putin is obviously looking at the proximity of the war, given the relationships with Europe, the US, and China. But when he becomes free to just, navigate the world again as it was before the war, I think Lula da Silva will be there to try to translate Russian policy into the region again, and to try to think about Russia as a country which is not in war anymore, but a country that is trying to reconnect. So I think that if that happens in the short term, it would also match with Trump policy towards the Western Hemisphere. So Trump has clearly given signals of how he tries to balance out the triumviratum of China, Russia, and Iran. I think he's clearly sending signals about the Panama Canal and about Antarctica, about Greenland as key strategic windows and doors towards the Western Hemisphere, which will probably control routes for logistical routes for trade and commerce, which are currently being used by the Russians anyway. So we shouldn't be just seeing the relationship as a binary relationship between Latin America and Russia, but I think there are multiple mediators of that relationship. That leaves me to say about 3 or 4 bullet points, which is Russia has always been not an ideological alternative, but also an economic alternative to these countries. You must think about Argentinian and Brazilian industry, such as in energy, in food, and in other raw materials that end up in the Russian economy. You need to think about the military and technological assets that are currently present in Latin America, and that they don't only belong to modern Russia, but they also belong to the Cold War Soviet Union, in which you can still see some of these war material being used by countries such as Peru or Ecuador, for instance. And then again, just to close up this first segment, I think Russia will be able to capitalize on a dormant region such as Latin America, mostly because Latin America is also going through its up and downs. Although, as I've mentioned, there is a lot of thinking about a global governance that is ruled by smaller countries such as Brazil, or the invitation to Argentina to the BRICS and so on. I think these are countries that are really struggling domestically. So in order to fight poverty, in order to fight criminality or internal violence, they really need to look at their alternatives, and Russia will become an alternative as it was before.
Thanks so much, Carlos. I think on that last point, I mean, I think you highlighted very well that Latin America is becoming this sort of venue for a bit of multipolar competition, with the United States now, of course, stepping up under Trump and creating perhaps an uncomfortable situation for some governments in the region, China already there, and the possibility that Russia emerges as a partner, or at least an opportunity to hedge against some of those pressures, after the war. What do you think the countries will see as Russia's main advantages are? I mean, it's obviously had a long-standing relationship with countries like Venezuela and Cuba. Are there other areas that maybe sort of other countries which may now look to Russia when they come under pressure from, say, China or the United States?
Yeah, so if you think life is getting very expensive in Latin America, so these countries are really much looking forward to new opportunities with large loans that will not only serve the middle class indirectly by countries building new bridges, new highways, new ports, as we've seen the Chinese interest recently in countries such as Peru with the massive port of Chancay. So Russia can also jump into that wagon and become a new lender of money. It will obviously be linked to the economic state of the financial arcs in Moscow. But it clearly is a soft power link which Russia can have in the region by lending money, which is so needed in Latin America at the moment.
Great, thanks very much. So perhaps I think we could start to turn to some of the questions which have been coming in, and thanks so much for posting your questions. Please continue to do so. Perhaps I can turn to Emily and Ed initially to kick off and group a couple of questions together here, which I think is really about Emily's point about the need to have a Russian strategy coming out of the Ukraine conflict. And so we have a question from Irina Mamulashvili, which I think goes to this question: so what is driving Russian foreign policy? Is it about status recognition with the West? Is it about restoring its imperial ambitions? So really sort of regathering the lost lands of the former Soviet Union, or even the Russian Empire before it. And I think Ben Baltrop asks, sort of, how then does the West respond to that? If we are now likely to face a Russia that is not just looking at annexing parts of Ukraine, but actually essentially trying to assert a division of Europe once again, and have a particular role for Russia, and perhaps an exclusive role, or at least blocking the West being engaged in countries like Belarus, South Caucasus, Central Asia. How do we manage that? How does the Euro-Atlantic community try to deal with this problem? Emily, over to you.
Thanks. Oh, well, that's quite a lot of different things to try to answer. So I think I'll start with maybe whether we think that Russia is an imperial power. I know that this is an argument that I think lots of people have made, and I don't necessarily agree with it. I don't think that Russia has a sort of interest in reasserting the whole of the former Soviet Union. The quote that you often hear bandied around, which is that you know, Putin thought that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a disaster. Yes, because of the sort of the cultural and historical memory of Russia means that actually it was really challenging for much of society. And there is a huge collective trauma, I think, about the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Does that mean that Putin is seeking to restore it? Certainly in terms of capability, I don't think that's even practically reasonable for it to do. And I don't see that there's been any attempt to do that. And I think in terms of foreign policy, it sort of depends on which countries you're talking about. So we talked about the exceptionalism of Belarus and Ukraine, where Russia's interests go beyond just sort of intervention in politics. It's that Russia sees that as an extension of its territory. So of course, for Ukraine, this is a serious security concern. When it comes to things like the Baltic states, yes, for Russia psychologically, having lost the Baltic states to NATO and the EU, I think was a huge blow. Have they been able to reconcile that? Possibly not. But Russia has lots of other tools of influence, as we know, you know, intervention in politics and business, especially in the Baltic states. And then when it comes to sort of how do we respond to Russia's attempts to, I don't know, sow division or cyber attacks? I mean, frankly, Russia's attempts to sort of disrupt society and sow chaos and disinformation are not a huge amount of effort for Russia, especially in certain places where they sort of capitalize on tensions that already exist. And obviously, there's this whole sort of adage about the Russian intelligence services are much more sort of less capable, perhaps, than we give them credit for. And we often tend to look at the more successful operations by Russia and not the multiple failures that do happen sort of in the background that we just don't know about. So Russia has lots of, I guess, tools of foreign policy at its disposal to do that. Now, how does the West sort of counter that? You know, I guess there's a lot of discussion about sort of resilience of societies, but what Russia does is that it capitalizes on problems that already exist often, because that is a much less effortful thing to do. So perhaps the idea of trying to fix some of our domestic problems at home mean that there is less opportunity for Russia to do things like that. But as I said, it's really depending on the country. The level of Russia's interest depends on the priority where it sits in Russia's priority and where it sits in terms of resources. So to go, by the way, to a question that I can see below on things like the Baltic states, just to touch on what I was saying earlier, you know, whether you think that Russia's imminently going to sort of turn to the Baltic states in the absence of a war in Ukraine, I think the likelihood is not. There's lots of different reasons for that, but I think partly Russia does not necessarily need to resort to something as clumsy as warfare to exert its influence over its neighbors. And it has plenty of other levers and ways of doing that in the Baltic states without having the kind of mass casualties that you can see going on in Ukraine at the moment.
Thanks so much. Before we go to Ed to perhaps sort of respond on how the Euro-Atlantic community can continue to maintain a relationship with countries in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus and so on, and have a Russia policy. I just wanted to go back, Emily, on this issue about Russia as an imperial actor. I mean, ahead of the invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin wrote a long essay about Ukraine. He made these very long television statements, which looked a lot like imperialism. And it was about reclaiming lost lands. It was about challenging the idea that there are distinct nation states. It was about challenging the idea that there is indeed a Ukrainian nation at all. And it was about a historical basis for Russian statehood that goes far beyond the current borders. How do you respond to those who say actually that this is really what is driving Russia?
Yeah, I don't think that really contradicts what I mean. I think that when it comes to Russia taking chunks out of, say, northern Kazakhstan, which is what lots of people have been talking about, you know, the last few years, that's very different to the way that Russia sees Ukraine. I've never argued with the fact that the way Russia sees Ukraine absolutely is to not only sort of intervene in politics like it does in, say, Central Asia, in the Baltic states, in other places that we would traditionally have called spheres of influence. But with Ukraine and Belarus, it's completely different. Now, if you look at the way Russia approaches Belarus, it's not even a client state anymore. Russia sees that as an extension of its own territory. And now, obviously, internationally, we and NATO somewhat see that too, because Belarus was a co-aggressor in the war. It was the launch pad for the invasion of Kiev. It was the logistical supply of the war, without which Russia would not have been able to supply much of the front. They are as close as two nations could be without actually being absorbed within each other. And it's been quite clear, both from Putin's essay, both from things that he said, that was Russia's intention towards Ukraine as well. So, okay, maybe the semantics of it, we could debate, but I'm not sure that Russia is an imperial power in the sense that it wants to restore, say, the entirety of the original Russian Empire, the entirety of the former Soviet Union. What I think is that there is a distinction to be made between where these countries sit in terms of Russian priorities. And absolutely right that Ukraine should be extremely concerned that whatever settlement happens along the lines, say, and I guess we're getting into the weeds of discussing negotiations and things, but whatever happens, Russia will still remain probably some sort of control over these annexed territories. And that is a huge concern because Ukraine cannot guarantee really that Russia would not try something again, maybe within a few years' time. So it obviously those things kind of depend on capabilities and things like that, but I think the intent is still very much there from the Russian side.
Okay, thanks. Ed?
I mean, just briefly on the first part of the question of what's driving sort of the Russian engagement on this, I think aside from the arguments about it, imperial power and what Russia ultimately wants, there's also an element of pragmatism at the moment. I mean, the special military operation failed. They were in a war of attrition and making grinding advances. And on the rate of advance that we saw last year, just to seize the rest of the Donbass, which would sort of be a political objective that Russia could say, well, we have achieved this in terms of military aims. I mean, it would be sort of 2027. So Russia, I think, in terms of this engagement, they've seen the opportunity to deal with Trump because he wants to bring a swift conclusion to this phase of the war, at least. I don't think it will end the war, but it will definitely move into a new phase. And engaging, and thus far, although it's only a couple of weeks in, ultimately got what they want. I mean, the Russian Federation devised two draft treaties, presented as two draft treaties in December 21, which effectively, the first one to the US, the second to NATO, and that was an attempt to sort of do a deal over the Europeans' heads directly with the US. Same as Medvedev's Treaty on European Security in 2009, fairly consistent. And I think that's where the worry is at the moment in terms of Europe. So how to make sure that the Europeans have a stake. And I think, such is the relative weakness of Europe collectively in terms of defense and security. I do worry that there's no real good options that I can see at the moment for Europe. This is about mitigating the worst case scenario. This is not about coming up with a strategy that is ultimately very advantageous to Europeans. And then in terms of Russia's intent, yeah, it's exactly the same. And there's a variety of timelines of when Russia may conventionally be able to sort of provide a credible threat again to NATO, and they sort of 3, 5, 7 years, etc. But they're all predicated on Russia not fighting at its current intensity in Ukraine. So as soon as you move into anything which stops the Russians fighting at this level of intensity, that starts the clock. And when you see not just the amount that's going into Russian defense expenditure, but in terms of the specific equipment, such as drone production, skyrocketing at the moment, they're getting prepared for something. Obviously, they need to rearm and re-provide that conventional deterrence capability, but also that will be a potentially direct threat to the Baltics. And that's why, to my earlier point, that while we are very concerned of the future of Ukraine, making sure Ukraine has agency, all of those sorts of issues that the politicians in the West talk about, the priority does have to be NATO and ultimately making sure that Article 5 is credible. That is very, very consistent. But in other areas, in terms of, again, hybrid response, I mean, we are seeing a gradual improvement of that. If we look at the relatively new sort of issue of the threat of undersea cable damage, sabotage, primarily in the Baltics, which really only actually started after the war. Initially the new polar bear, which cut the Baltic connector into cable 8th of October 23, and the ship left, went through the Northern Sea route back to the Indo-Pacific before we even sort of discussed it amongst ourselves. You know, you had the Yipeng 3 incident in November as well, which was similar last year. The Eagle S, well, the Finns boarded the vessel immediately, said, this is absolutely in our legal parameters, we're going to do this. The Swedes followed suit the week after. So, I mean, Europe is starting to react to all of these issues, you know, intelligence pre-bunking, which has been a tool throughout the war. All of these things are something, actions and, you know, within the European toolkit, and they are getting better, but quite slowly. And I think the risk, though, for the Europeans is some of those levers, for example, within the EU, the primary lever, sanctions. Well, what happens if the US puts pressure on the EU to ease sanctions on Russia? That's where the challenge is going to be, because ultimately, like I said again in my comments, any increase in Russian economic health is likely to go on defense. It might not, they might reduce that, but at the moment, I mean, in terms of the attempt, like Emily said, that's going to remain high. So it's an odd position for the EU to be in, especially from pressure from the US, which might be in actual tariffs between the US and EU. And I don't think the Europeans or the EU has a response for that. Thanks.
Thanks, Ed. While we're on the issue of threats, Mary Dejewski has asked, does Russia not have security concerns too that might underlie at least some of what it does? And of course, there has been some comments in the Trump administration that actually taking account of Russian security interests will be the core of actually putting in place a sustainable and stable peace agreement with Ukraine. So how much do you think of this is actually what's been going on also is driven by Russia's own security concerns, NATO enlargement and these kind of issues?
I think you need to differentiate between what Putin and Lavrov say and what the Russians do. If the Russians were really worried about NATO encroachment and sort of direct military threats to Russia, they wouldn't have moved pretty much all of their military capability from the Kola Peninsula that could fight and go to Ukraine, which have been already declared combat ineffective. You see the air defense assets around St. Petersburg all put into Ukraine. I mean, actually, when you look at the largest land border that they now have with NATO, and in terms of, you know, post-accession aggression towards Finland and Sweden, there was not much. There's been hybrid activity, but there has always. So, I mean, I think that is pretty clear evidence that NATO does not see a direct military threat from a defensive alliance of NATO. I think, obviously, in terms of what Putin and Lavrov say, that's very, very different. But also, we need to understand that we're not the audience. You know, when, you know, people within Russian political leadership say, well, NATO's an aggressor, etc., they're not talking to us. They're talking to other partners that they want around the world to sort of sway their opinion on NATO and a Western-based rules-based international order that favors the West. So I think that's just something that we have to be mindful of as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Burcu, we've had a question about the Russia-Iran relationship, I think, which you spoke about. And the question is really about the nuclear cooperation between the two countries. The Rosatom, the Russian company, the nuclear company, has been supplying Iran with its civil nuclear materials. And the question is really, I think, to what extent actually is that actually been a cover for other kinds of like dual use perhaps activity that has allowed Iran to advance its military nuclear program. And in exchange, Russia has been receiving drones from Iran and other kinds of support. So, you know, how much of that kind of military cooperation, particularly in the nuclear sphere, is now at the core of the Russia-Iran relationship?
I think if we step back, what the real concern here is how we define Russia, the Russia-Iran relationship. And the issue is whether it's a sort of a marriage of convenience, whether it's based on notions of tit for tat, of transactionalism, or whether this is an enduring strategic partnership that will be sort of forevermore, right? And I think it's more the marriage of convenience. I mean, Russia and Iran were in many ways thrust together to be able to create sort of an alliance to respond to Western sanctions and what they perceive to be sort of acts of unfounded hostility against Iranian and Russian interests, respectively. I struggle to buy in to the notion that Russia in the long term sees that it is in Russia's interest to facilitate a theocratic Islamic regime in Iran going nuclear. I don't see how that would be in Russia's medium to long-term interest. I think a relevant question is also what Iran seeks to achieve militarily in terms of military support and facilitation from Russia. We're seeing, for example, Iran's growing interest in recovering, in rehabilitating its air defense systems. So could Russia continue to support in that realm? Iran is moving increasingly in the direction of recovering its power projection and real capabilities as a naval power, right? So we're seeing more movement there in Iran reasserting itself as a naval power. And of course, its ballistic missile and drone program as well. So there are other areas in which Iran could seek Russian military technical support and the transfer of dual use technologies, and other than the nuclear question. I think Lavrov recently said that, of course, Russia is a signatory to the 2015 JCPOA. Russia recently said that they were optimistic that the diplomatic option remains on the table with respect to future US-Iran negotiations on the nuclear question. So I think there is sort of hedging on the part of Russia with respect to how committed it is to its sort of partnership with Iran. And I know this might seem odd to say, given that they recently signed a 20-year strategic agreement, cooperation across sort of military, technical, trade spheres. But Russia, from a pragmatic point of view, as a civilizational power, and we could go into the nuances of how that's defined, but the question is, Russia is aware that the Islamic regime in Iran might not be as resilient as it believes itself to be, right? So there are questions about the sustainability of Iran as it is today. We're entering a new phase where the US and Israel appear to be preparing for an escalated set of activities against Iran. I've spoken about this before. I think Iraq is going to be pivotal in the immediate coming future in terms of squeezing Iran's influence and its revenue streams from Iraq as well. Iraq has really been the economic lungs of Iran. So there are other dynamics at play right now across the region that raise the question of to what extent is the regime in Iran resilient or enduring? And Russia is well aware of these, knowing full well the power, the game of great power politics. And so, yes, whilst it's a pressing question, it's an important question. Can Russia and Iran sort of link up further on the nuclear file? I think that the Russia just does not see its interest in supporting that at this time.
Thanks very much. We're getting a lot of questions, I think, understandably, about Ukraine and the possible end of the war in Ukraine. So perhaps, Emily and Ed, I'll come to you, and I'll try and sort of summarize a little bit and group these together. I mean, the questions seem to be essentially, is there a possible end to the conflict of the war in Ukraine? Does Russia really want that? If it does happen, will Russia then look to just prepare for a second war? Because there's questions about whether the Russian elite actually really views sort of Belarus and Ukraine as essentially an extension of Russian territory, or at least as a kind of security buffer zone around that. And then there's a particular sort of questions about what exactly the settlement looks like. David Clark, for example, asks about this reported statement that Russia has said absolutely no to NATO membership for Ukraine, but the EU track seems a possibility. And lastly, I think that there's an interest in the security arrangements around Ukraine, both from the Russian and the European side. Are there risks of escalation involving, for example, Eddie already spoke about this to some degree, about the deployment of European forces into Ukraine? Are there particular risks and dangers around that? So perhaps I could ask each of you to sort of look at it from the particular side you cover. So how is Russia looking at the end of the Ukraine war, do you think, Emily, and where it goes from there? And then I'll come to you, Ed.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I think there's a few different considerations here. So firstly, does Russia want an end to the war? I think probably yes, but it's a little bit complicated. Russia could probably keep this up for a few more years. We can debate the economics of it. But Russia has got a few important things coming up. You've got State Duma parliamentary elections coming up this year. The United Russia Party is not very popular, in large part due to the war. The elite, do they really matter anymore? I mean, the kind of traditional, I think, idea at the beginning of the war was, will the war reach a certain critical point at which wealthy oligarchs will start to put pressure on Putin to end the war? And I think there was a resounding no to that argument, because clearly their level of influence on Putin and on major security decisions like the war is not sufficient enough to sway policy. The influence of oligarchs is sort of changing now. Yes, they're still important, but there are much more important political people at the moment, political players. The system that Putin is kind of building is moving towards sort of, fathers and sons within important places in the Duma, in different ministries. People who are coming through the ranks are now, it moved from these sort of technocrats and people who are actually maybe good at their jobs to people who are completely shaped by the system, and in many ways completely shaped by the war. People who have come back from the war, people who've distinguished themselves. And when the war does come to an end, which it will at some point, there will be a reckoning of who has performed well, who deserves demotion and promotion, and Putin will have to figure that out. But the point is that Russian society and Russian political society is going to be quite a different animal than what it was when the war started. So Putin, I think, is trying to build a bit of a legacy, both in terms of the system that he's creating around him, but also in his image as peacemaker. And you can sort of see that over the past 18 months, Russia has kind of changed its rhetoric on the war, portraying Ukraine as the unreasonable party, unwilling to come to the table. I mean, look, we don't buy this argument whatsoever, but this is what Moscow has kind of been saying, which is that they would have been prepared for a solution. Obviously, it was one that Ukraine found completely unacceptable. So now I think Russia does want the war to end. Obviously, its war goals are significantly revised down from what they were originally. If taking over Ukraine and inserting a puppet leader was the main goal, they've massively failed. But that doesn't really matter to Russia. It's very easy to kind of spin the ownership of these annexed territories as a major win for Russia. There's lots of natural resources there, as we know, that they could capitalize on. And then there's this debate about whether NATO versus EU membership for Ukraine is the sort of lesser of two evils. Okay, no to NATO membership for Ukraine, but maybe yes to the EU. And why does Russia seem to prefer that? There could be a couple of reasons, but I wonder if sort of having EU membership, a little bit like the Transnistria and Moldova conflict, which is lots of people use as a kind of comparison to how the war might look at the end, a frozen conflict, a bit of a buffer zone that Russia controls, some sort of peacekeeping regime that Russia can dial up and dial down the pressure as it likes to exact political concessions, all of those things. But actually, Transnistria, which is pretty much funded and supported by Russia, loyal to Russia, politically, economically, whatever, Transnistria benefits hugely from its DCFTA that Moldova has with the EU. Now, it's not quite full European membership, but a lot of the organized criminal groups and the, I don't mean the people benefit, by the way, that the leadership does, from trade with the EU indirectly. So if having a Ukraine that's, say, relatively militarily defanged, but also has some kind of economic backdoor to the European Union that Russia technically could exploit, as could a lot of the organized criminal groups that have massively profited from the war, reselling weapons and precious metals, that could actually benefit Russia. So if Russia is looking for a way to supplement some of its economy, because supporting the annexed territories that it's now got is actually a huge financial burden. So if you've got Russia propping up not only the territory of Crimea, the annexed territories, its own Russian regions like Chechnya that really depend on subsidies from Moscow, as well as the rest of Russia more broadly, actually having some annexed territories that are able to support themselves somewhat is a huge bonus for Russia. Now, I don't know whether that's actually going to come to pass, but I wonder if that is kind of factoring into Russia's consideration about whether EU membership might not be such a disaster for Ukraine as it was, say, in 2014, which is what kind of happened in the beginning when Ukraine was talking about its association agreement with the EU, which sparked off a lot of the conflicts that we have now with Russia. So yeah, I wonder if that might be kind of some of the considerations.
Ed, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, don't want to get too much into semantics, but I think it is worth saying, like, when we talk about the end of the war, I don't think that's what we're talking about. I think it's a period where the shooting will stop, whether that's a ceasefire or all the other sort of mechanisms that could be, because ultimately whatever is agreed in the next couple of months, they're not going to address the underlying causes of the war even before 2022. And if you look at Zelensky's peace plan in terms of also, 10-point peace plan and issues about justice, in terms of the atrocities that have happened in Ukraine, I just don't think there'll ever be agreement, even if Zelensky does step down to get a deal at the moment. And both sides they're exhausted after 3 years of very heavy fighting. So I think we will go into a period where the fighting becomes less intense, but also that can backtrack and continue to escalate. I don't have, there's a lot that could go on potentially, but just in terms of security arrangements and the risks and dangers, I mean, how many do you want? And I think this is the real concern at the moment. And back to my very first point about how quickly that the US is wanting to move on this, that is a real risk for Europeans. Because like I said, NATO is never going to do a military mission within Ukraine. The Russians wouldn't allow it. An issue about Article 5 that Defense Secretary Hegseth spoke about in the last couple of years, in months. The EU can't do it. They're just not capable of doing an operation like this. So you're left with the coalition of the willing. The coalition of the willing might not just be European as well. And I think the biggest risk for Europeans is jumping into a mission which is ill-defined, kind of difficult, probably without the relative, the numbers that are available just on the UK. I mean, I think a minimum commitment would be a brigade, 5,000 on rotation. That's 15,000. That's 20% of the entire British Army and around 50% of the field army, the one that actually can deploy in combat. And then you've got the Kabrit and NATO commitments within Estonia. And you'd actually then be making a military commitment to Ukraine, a non-NATO member, over and above Estonia, a NATO member. So just on the numbers, I think there's issues. I think there's also political issues. The current plan that we sort of know a little bit seems to be a UK-France plan. That's sensible in the sense that both have deployed brigades since the Cold War, the UK also at a divisional level. But what happens if the French presidential election in 27's won by Le Pen and then she withdraws French troops immediately? Who backfills that? Real sort of political issues as well. And then just look at the track record. Libya, failure from NATO. Afghanistan, 20-year operation, most important military mission that the NATO has ever undertaken, failure. Iraq, coalition of the willing, inconclusive towards failure. I mean, even look at Kosovo. I mean, it was an operation that was in 99 and we're still sending reinforcements under KFOR all these years later because we haven't addressed the underlying causes. So I think there's a big risk. And from a European point of view, if it's a choice of the Europeans doing it or more global sort of potential mission, I think, again, it would be riskier for the Europeans to go into a mission that they don't understand and they're unprepared for than actually just say, we can't do this because there are too many risks. And I think, although all of those examples I provided were discretionary operations, I mean, this isn't a discretionary operation. Even if it's a coalition of the willing that's not NATO, not a NATO mission, it could be existential for NATO as an organization if the mission fails. Thank you.
Carlos, on the Ukraine settlement, I mean, countries in Latin America have been asked during the war to take sides, to either support Russia or swing behind Ukraine. We now seem to be approaching some kind of settlement. Is there any discussion in the region about where Latin America should go on the settlement? I mean, Brazil, I think at one point had its peace plan of its own. It's not impossible that we may end up with some kind of a UN Security Council mandated monitoring force, which may then look to countries beyond Europe, perhaps even from Latin America, to supply sort of blue helmeted peacekeepers. Does Latin America feel itself a stakeholder in the outcome of the war, having been sort of so engaged in the actual fighting so far?
I think only up to a certain point. I think Ed is correct that a non-European coalition of the willing or blue helmet troops in Ukraine will be difficult to pull together. I think that if you look at the Latin American history of contributing to UN troops, it's a rich history, considering not just Haiti, but the rest of the world. Haiti, at the moment, it's a crisis in itself, which has called for UN troops and which Latin American countries have not been favorable of. So you need to think that currently we have Kenyan troops in Haiti. So could Latin Americans travel to Ukraine? Well, absolutely political decisions, such as Ed has mentioned. But also, I think some countries which have a rich history of providing blue helmets, such as Brazil, are too politically invested. So how could a Brazilian foreign policy, with all that they've done so far, present troops that will stay neutral to both parts? That leaves you with another 3 countries which also have a track record in UN troops, which are Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. But then again, how will these countries internally commit to a faraway conflict if they have not to a close one, such as Haiti? So although this is the conversation that has been starting to be on the table, I think that politically and physically, it's a short-term one with a probable no.
Thanks very much. Emily, we've got a few questions, I think, about the Russia-China relationship, where that's going, where the war may leave it, and also about how China and Russia, China and India have developed their relationship to Russia around the war, where we have seen those 3 maintaining sort of reasonably close ties, at least on a bilateral basis. But maybe Burcu, perhaps you also wanted to comment about, I mean, do we see any kind of Russia-China cooperation in the Middle East? We often talk about this axis, Russia-China axis, but does it actually have any regional dimensions, or is it essentially confined to, again, a bilateral relationship? It's not really about global cooperation on the ground. Emily, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, look, that relationship is, it's very difficult to characterize, because beyond the sort of headlines of Putin and Xi and their warm words, actually a lot of the economic trade that they're kind of trying to push is not where either side wants it to be. It should have been much greater, considering the amount of agreements that have been signed. There's lots of reasons for that. There's lots of internal reasons within Russia. Firstly, because it is not possible for Russia practically to increase much more its cargo transport to China. There's lots of very well documented rail transport and road transport reasons for that. But then there's sort of a bit of competition between them as well, because Putin is sort of trying to reorientate trade from the Far East, as was sort of a plan for the past sort of, at least since 2013. It's been a bit of a push, but what the war did was it kind of catalyzed the need for that to be more pressing. And so a huge amount of investment going into the Russian Far East to try to boost trade actually hasn't really borne a huge amount of fruit. There is still a little bit of a problem around, say, oil versus coal deliveries. Coal is a very low value item. It's easily transported. Oil is a higher value item, more difficult to transport. But then, you know, China has been pushing for things like mates rates, sort of amounts for Russian hydrocarbons, which Russia does not want to do, obviously. And now Russia's dependency on China for a huge amount of trade and for its economy is a weakness. There's lots of talk about trying to pry Russia and China apart. I don't think that's realistic. I think it's also a little dangerous. Whether I can see another question about that, whether sort of we think that China is able to influence Russian politics, perhaps not really in a nefarious way as that maybe suggests. Learning from each other, yes. They've got lots of commonality, including ideas about the way their countries should be run. They learned from each other when it came to COVID restrictions. You saw lots of scientific collaboration going on there, science, shutting down of the internet, control of free speech and citizens. All of those are kind of common to relatively, you know, authoritarian regimes. That doesn't mean that they're similar. And there are huge amounts of differences between them. There's a lot of espionage that goes on both sides. It's not really very well reported in Russia because it's a little embarrassing, but it does happen, especially in the academic and the military engineering community. So that is a source of tension. I suppose it feels like the sort of thing that you could exploit and try to drive a wedge between them. And Trump has been quite sort of vocal about the fact that he views China perhaps as an even greater, you know, in economic political terms, threat than Russia. I'm not sure how accurate that is. And the China-Russia relationship is built on a lot more than just Putin and Xi. There are lots of different regional, local levels between them. So trying to move that apart is a very painstaking and very difficult task that for now, I don't think either side really has much appetite to do.
Thanks, Emily. And Burcu, I think you've got a couple of minutes.
Yes, just briefly, in terms of Russia and China in the Middle East, I think a shared objective is to diminish the US presence and influence in the region, and to be able to empower local allies to carry out what is in Russia's and Chinese interests in the region. And here, this approach aligns with, I think, the Trump administration's in terms of a desire to avoid being entangled in forever wars in the Middle East. Both Russia and China have mainly economic, energy, and investment priorities in the region. But at the same time, in terms of this grand narrative, both are interested in presenting an alternative model for allies in the Middle East, an alternative to the US-led liberal international rules-based order, however we define that. And China and Russia are interested in proposing and standing behind an alternative. So what you hear often and persistently by many different political actors in the Middle East is this notion that relations with mainly China, but also Russia to an extent, are based on a framework of mutual respect and respectability, which is not how they've been approached by the United States and European allies in the recent past. So China has been promoting a non-interventionist approach in how it engages with the Middle East. It doesn't use the term sort of peace building aggressively, for example. It rather promotes its role as facilitating dialogue and peace processes that are sort of homegrown or indigenous to the region. And so, again, when we look at this, perhaps it's best to kind of step back and consider the wider geopolitical dynamics that are shaping up in terms of alliances that seek to counter what the West has projected in the Middle East.
Thanks very much. I think, unfortunately, that we've run out of time. I mean, I think that the analysts today have made it clear that the Ukraine conflict has been, in fact, an international conflict, that Russia's interests and Russia's role internationally have been reshaped by that war, and that an end to the Ukraine conflict will not mark an end to that change. They will continue to be reshaped and evolve. Russia has been acting as a global actor, and so the Ukraine war itself has had global dimensions. But that war has both created a new international reality, but also been part of wider changes going on, and we've heard about that in terms of the evolving Russia-China relationship, Russia-Iran, but also the variety of actors in different regions that are increasingly being involved in those regions, but with great power politics of which Russia is part. And so I think I also take away from this Emily's remark that we need to have a Russia strategy as the Ukraine war comes to an end. But that Russia strategy isn't just about Ukraine. It's about much wider European security, and it needs to take account of all of these global dimensions of Russia's evolving foreign and security policy, both where it remains a direct threat to European interest, but also part of that wider shifting pattern of global affairs that we see, including, of course, the United States, which we haven't touched upon so much in this conversation, but clearly is going to shape many of those changes in the years ahead. So thanks very much to the panelists. You did a great job of covering, I think, quite a complicated issue at an important time. But also thanks very much to the audience for putting all of your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't cover all of them. We did our best, and I think it was a really good conversation because of that. But please do tune in again. And if you want to find out more about the work of the international security team at RUSI, please visit our website or listen in to the Global Security Briefing podcast, which we produce bi-weekly on many of these things. But today, thanks very much and goodbye.